So the other day, I was looking through Amazon Prime with my girlfriend, and the new Lord of the Rings series popped up, The Rings of Power. Now, don't worry, this is not going to be another YouTube video where I just bitch and complain about how The Rings of Power, has gone against the original lore. It's inaccurate to what Tolkien wrote. It's anti-male. It's anti-white. It's anti-European. All those things might be true. They are true. But that's not really what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to talk about this very uncomfortable feeling when you see it. The feeling that something has been disgraced or tarnished. And even those who aren't anti-woke still feel that way when they see it. Some soul at the center of the show has been removed. And why is that? YouTube is inundated with videos complaining about the series, but none of them really touch on that. And when I was thinking about this, two things came to mind. One was Theoden marching out of Helm's Deep to, he assumes, his death. Theoden, the king of the Rohirrim, the Anglo-Saxon stand-in. Another thing came to mind, which was the contemporary artist Damien Hirst, and a work of his named The Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, which is just a fantastic title. It's a brilliant title. But really, that work of art, it is just a title. Like all conceptual art, it's just pure trash. It's just an idea. It's just a title. The rest of it is attention-seeking garbage designed to brand Damien Hirst in this elaborate money laundering scheme that is contemporary art. But let's think about that title. I mean, what does it mean? The impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. And it brings to mind an old proverb of a tadpole living in a pond. And that pond is its entire life until one day it isn't. It hatches into a dragonfly and transcends above the water and flies around in a whole new existence. When it is a tadpole, it's impossible for it to imagine what is on the other side of the water. And yet when it is a dragonfly, it cannot go back. There's some barrier. Death exists this way for us. It's an impermeable barrier. It's a kind of impossibility within our minds. And it's no wonder that because of this, in all traditional societies, death is ceremonialized in funerals. Our ancestors lived with death as a fact of their life every day. Not just their friends and family dying, but war, disease, but it existed as a kind of a spiritual truth that they lived with every day. And it's no wonder that death in the form of funerals, birth and marriage take on these ceremonial positions in traditional societies, because they're where human beings are brought into contact with the immaterium, where the veil between us and what is beyond the world is made thin. And this brings us on to the problem that the people producing Lord of the Rings have with it. And that is that to truly understand its characters, its themes, the motivations of it, these ancient myths that Tolkien found the divine in, you have to call upon something which lies outside of modernism, outside of liberalism, or outside of individualism. And this is dangerous because it exposes you to all kinds of philosophical and political paradigms that are actually incredibly threatening to modernism, to liberalism, and to individualism, and expose you to perhaps harsh truths which contradict and threaten our current state religion of equality. And this really gets us onto the true motivation of why the show is the way it is. It's not just there to make money. They could produce anything and market it so much, they would make money. They have a monopolistic business model to some extent. The motivation of producing the show is to tarnish this metaphysical objectivist spirit of the work. This spirit cannot be integrated into the modern world, so it must be degraded into a pure consumer product. So here the purpose of the show is an act of spiritual war to attack those who identify so deeply with the metaphysical message of the work, mostly young European men, and who draw upon that spiritual meaning, and to degrade and deny that spiritual meaning. So that is a large factor in why the show was rewritten in the way that it was. And this also, it reminds me, talking of this, of Jonathan Bowden, who was the chief ideological officer of a unnameable British political party. In one interview, he was asked, why is it that he is not a liberal? And he said, well, when my mother died, his family and all the friends of his family, they came to him and said basically, oh, what a shame. Oh, your mother's died. Oh, that's such a shame. And this reminded me of when a family member of mine died, someone who was instrumental in my upbringing. And at the service, there was this Anglican female priestess, and she basically spent the entire service denying and apologizing for the Christian doctrine, much to my amusement and my surprise. But there she was on stage, making these nebulous appeals to this sort of spiritual individualism and spiritual subjectivism. I was filled with this feeling of rage. I felt like a kind of form of desecration was taking place, and it was pretty pathetic. I didn't hold to any of those Christian doctrines at the time, but I knew there was at least one person in that room who should believe them, and instead they were making apologies for them, and were offering nothing but this sort of ideological babble, which showed that she didn't really believe them, or if she did, she believed them below a higher commitment to cultural pluralism or moral relativism or a sort of multi-faith tolerance. And it was incredibly insulting to me that she would use the death of one of my family members as a platform to spread this sort of subversive ideological crap. And this was a deep moment in my life. For the first time, I'd been brought into contact with something beyond the bounds of this world. I'd been brought into contact with death. I don't care about any of this. Just tell me about hell, tell me about heaven, and give this moment some kind of higher spiritual meaning. So when I hear Bowden, who I might have many disagreements with, talk about this experience, I recognize it and I feel his pain acutely. And something was just not quite right. Something was just repulsive. The similar thing that is repulsive about the modern Lord of the Rings. Some deep spiritual meaning has been denied to us. And this brings us on to the second thing, which is Theoden marching out of Helm's Deep to what he presumes is his death. He's sacrificing himself for something greater. And it's not just out of necessity, it's a kind of manic glory. It's a higher duty. It's a kind of nobility to march gleefully into slaughter that seems, and self-sacrifice, that is just completely alien to many of our age. Surely is not Theoden possessed by a kind of psychosis similar to that of suicide bombers. But we know that that's not the case. That's not a full description of what it is. And it's because Theoden has completely accepted death. And by completely accepting death, he's also accepted life. So our modern religion of liberalism, individualism, it rejects death, and it can't give an account for these deep moments in our lives. And by rejecting death, it also rejects life, because they are one in the same. The only kind of life that modernism, materialism, liberalism can offer is a kind of living death of nothing but pure comfort and the pursuit of material goods. And in this way, we can see the rewriting of Lord of the Rings as an actual act of spiritual war. And if we are to believe that social progress will continue indefinitely into the future, if we are to believe in this purely progressive understanding of the human spirit, of technology, of social order, then what really is there for us in the future? There will be no more heroic last stands. There will be nothing to march into death for. We will be basically indistinguishable from machines, and death truly will be impossible in the minds of those living, only they won't really be alive. It is therefore our duty to reject modernism, liberalism, individualism and equality, and embrace death, so that we might truly live.